Hey, welcome back to the War Journal podcast. Today I have a really interesting story to share with you and really talk about my first combat experience as a 20-year-old Marine in Desert Storm. So we start off with a journal entry, February 27th, 1991. These past 2 days have been fun-filled. First, our first combat patrol on vehicles. I manned the 50 cal, which saw an awesome 5 rounds leave its chamber on an innocent water tower. As we continued on, though, we got caught in a firefight. It wasn't scary, even though rounds were flying as close to 10 feet away. After about 5 minutes of this, a ceasefire was sounded, and we found out we were shooting at 1st Marine Division. Just another example of the world's most elite fighting unit in action. Luckily, nobody was hurt in this awesome display of firepower. So as I look back on my first combat firefight, I can remember that we left the staging area and I was on the 50 cal, and we didn't have time to BZO or test fire weapons, which is something that we traditionally do, and we headed out. So before we got to our first rally point, I decided that I was gonna test fire at the 50 cal. So I unloaded a couple of rounds on a water tower, and it was quite interesting what happened. I mean, everybody started freaking out once they heard the 50 cal start shooting, and everybody got scared, and people on the radio, they didn't know what was going on. I remember Kevin Corpinen, he was kind of freaked out, but overall it was, kind of just, that was who I was. I wanted to test fire my weapon and decided to, pull the trigger and squirt off a couple rounds, make sure we were good to go in case we got into a firefight. So I remember we were driving along and we were really just being pushed, and we were the lead element, and we were moving out and we're just driving, almost as fast as we can. And this is before we had GPS, pluggers and all the technology that you have today. And it was very rudimentary. And I remember a couple things. I remember at one point we were driving along in our vehicles in a staggered formation, and we came up on top of a wadi, and in front of us were Iraqi tanks. And I don't know if they were T-62s or T-72s, what they were, but for us in Humvees with 50 cals and Mark 19s, we can't engage in that with a tank or an APC. And we did have Cobras, close air support, on call. And I don't remember everything as clearly as I wish I could, but I do remember that once we saw the tanks, we turned back down into the wadi and we called for the close air support. And I can remember watching the Cobras come in just probably 50, 75, 100 feet off the ground, and they were above our position, and they fired the tow missiles, and I can remember seeing the tows go out and the wires from the tows, and we pulled up and we could watch the tanks blow up. And I remember watching a tank burning and the turret just get blown off the tank. And then we just started moving on again, and that was it. That was how quickly it was happening. And pretty soon we were close to Kuwait City. We could see on the horizon the city, the buildings, and as we got closer, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we started taking rounds. And anybody who's been in Kuwait or Desert Storm, there's these high tension wires that cross the desert, and as you get to the city, they surround the city. And in where we were at in our position when we started taking fire, we were right beside one of those large high tension wire towers, those big metal ones. And the minute we took contact, the vehicle stopped and we got into a quick formation and we started returning fire. And I remember I'm on the 50 cal, and it was, as I wrote, I wasn't scared, and I wasn't I can't really describe it, but I wasn't fearful. I was just, my training had just allowed me to go, okay, this is what I need to do, and that's what I do. And so we started returning fire. And at one point, I remember as I'm looking around, I hear the bullets bouncing off of the metal structure, only 10, 15 feet away from where I was. And I didn't even think about any of that. I was more focused on getting rounds down range, watching the tracer rounds go out of the 50 cal. We really couldn't see what we were shooting at. And at that point, I looked down at one of the other vehicles that was in front of us, and I watched somebody jump out of the back of the Humvee, and they threw their M16 on the ground as they were jumping out. And when they did jump out, they got behind the tire and they kind of just curled up in a ball and was hiding behind the tire. And in an instant, all I could do was I just grabbed, the A-gunner, and I'm like, get on the gun. And I jumped out of the back of the Humvee and ran across the desert, probably only about maybe 20 yards, 10, 15, 20 yards away. And when I got to the vehicle where, the Marine was, I just kicked him as hard as I could. And I just started screaming, get on the fucking gun, get the fuck up, get in the fight. And when he looked up, I was just in shock. It was the staff sergeant who had put the charge sheet against me, who had caught me with the ammunition, who had, kind of went to the lieutenant about the intel. And for me, it was not at the time, but it was vindication. Having the person who had created all of these things for me, and now here he was curled up behind a tire, behind the Humvee, and I'm yelling at him. And he looked at me, almost like in shock, and he kind of fumbled around and grabbed his rifle and jumped back up on the vehicle. And I ran back to the vehicle and got on the 50 cal. By that time, the firefight, across the radio, we started receiving words, cease fire, cease fire. So everybody's yelling at each other, cease fire, cease fire, cease fire. And so all of a sudden, going from chaos where rounds are hitting the stanchions of the tower, and just so much noise going on with rounds going everywhere, to almost like a tranquil, peaceful silence where people are looking around and nobody's shooting, and everybody starts talking, trying to figure out what's going on. And we found out through the radio that 1st Marine Division's lead element was coming into Kuwait City, and 2nd Marine Division's lead element, which was us, was coming into Kuwait City, and there was no coordination, and we engaged each other. And that's why I write, the world's most elite fighting unit in action against the world's most elite fighting unit in action. And luckily for us, there were no injuries, no KIAs, no wounded. And that was my first kind of reality to combat. And when I was in Afghanistan in other firefights, it really helped me understand how to act and behave and the things to do. And I'll share with everyone a very funny story about a firefight that I was in Afghanistan with a SEAL team. And that was, for me, it was a really eye-opening experience. Being in Marines and being in recon, I developed a disdain for the SEALs early on in my career. And I even now joke around and say, how do you know when there's a SEAL in the room? Don't worry, they'll tell you. But we were under-equipped. We didn't have all of the training. We didn't have the high-speed gear. And when we worked with the SEALs, there was almost a jealousy or an envy because of how they had the funding and the money and all the cool equipment and the Gucci stuff, and they're wearing Ray-Bans and have Velcro and all of this neat gear. And in the Marines, you just get by with what you have. But that experience really, as I talk in these next episodes of the staff sergeant and what happened, and my fear was that the staff sergeant would either retaliate by putting a charge sheet on me for either like assaults during combat or something, and that as in the next days that came, I was really concerned about what would happen. And there were only a couple people who saw what happened, and I'll talk about that in the next episode. But I want to end on this journal entry, and I believe it is probably the most powerful journal entry that I wrote as a 20-year-old Marine, and that helped me understand things. And I wish that I had read this, and now I'll share it with you. Today we saw our third mission, which was to go back where we were the day before and look the area over for any POWs we might have missed and weapons that might have been left back. Sounds pretty good, huh? Well, we weren't allowed to leave our vehicles, so how does one complete this mission? As I stand here and listen to Pink Floyd, the war, as I know it, is now over. Rumors of leaving are already being spread. My thoughts of the future are still blurry, but I must accomplish a couple things. I was writing in my journal and I was trying to be philosophical. I was trying to really understand what was happening in my head, and I was really having a difficult time. And I remember I went out, I sat by myself, I was drinking some of the Jack Daniels and sucking down some Marlboro Reds like candy. And for a moment I had a sense of clarity, and I captured that because I came back and wrote in the war journal. And this is what I wrote. I must enter again and try to tell you how I feel. I don't think anyone was really changed by this. Maybe they think they have, but not really. I know I have aged in years that cannot be counted on my face, but I can see. I have felt pain that I should not forget, so I will write to remind me in case I do forget. Don't forget the pain you have felt in death, betrayal, stress, and hatred. Know that there is a woman out there that will love you as much as you will love her and be happy and never need another forever. Also, find education because it can never be taken away from you. Thank you, God, for listening to my thoughts. I feel for once in my life you are watching. Just remember. Thanks again for your listening, and thank you for your support. I will talk about this journal entry and the things that have started happening, and I think the story will unfold a little more for everyone to understand the life lessons. I can truly say that these entries, this entry in particular, really are and really were things that helped me in my life with regard to education and faith and relationships, and I can't wait to share them with you. So until the next episode, thanks again, be safe,